Hello.
Hey, how are you?
I'm well. Did you see my note?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I put a couple slides together and I have a bunch of notes that I just took. I was just on the phone with her. So unless there's anything else that you wanted to touch on, I think we can delve into that.
That would be good. I have a urgent call at the bottom of the hour, so I'm going to have to bail at that time. So at 10:30 my time, 12:30 your time,
Okay, at the half hour.
at the half hour.
Okay. And how are you?
I'm doing okay.
Yeah, you have been, seems like you've been doing lots.
I've been halfway around the world and back.
Oh, it's exciting.
It is. It is. I don't know what our attendance is going to look like today. Mike is in Aruba. I don't know if he'll be able to join. Um, I think Helen is in Aruba.
Oh, everybody's in Aruba.
Yep.
Okay. Hey, Steve.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Okay, I'm just clearing, prepping our meeting notes here. So that we've got a good starting template.
Every Totally unrelated, but everything's looking good on that sample batch of CCDs. So
Good,
I'll drop them on the server in a minute.
excellent. Alrighty. Should we continue this conversation officially? We can give people another 2 minutes. Oh, there's Trevor.
He is not in Aruba.
I would like to be in Aruba today. It's very cloudy and gloomy here. Hello, Sir Trevor.
Hi there.
How are you? How are things in your part of the world?
Complicated.
Yes.
My father went into a nursing home this week or last week.
Oh,
Yeah. So I'm dealing with a lot of bureaucracy now.
mm-hmm.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Sorry to hear that. Is it at least a little relieving to you?
Yes. Yes. Well, I mean,
Sort
he's
of.
not able to be on his own. Like he's not able to manage without full-time care at this point. And
Right.
it's questionable, given that every day he spends immobile, whether he'll ever return to the baseline before he fell.
Right.
So that's where we're at.
Yep. This is a tricky time to manage.
Uh-huh.
My grandmother used to say, as long as I have my mobility and my marbles, I'll be okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, that's the only way to get through. The only way to enter the final, the departure lounge, so to speak.
Yes, some handle it more gracefully than others. Well, I wish that goes smoothly for you.
Thank you.
Alrighty. So we've got a couple of people. I've been working on some conversations offline so we can have a brainstorming discussion about some of that homework that I've done toward trying to move the needle forward with like a next step and maybe a next implementation for Cardea, given some of the expanded use cases we've been talking about. So before we dig into that, we need to officially cover our beginning of meeting activities. So welcome to today's edition, November 9th, of the Cardea user group work group. We are covered by the Hyperledger antitrust policy, as well as the Hyperledger Code of Conduct. I will put the link to our Confluence site in the chat for anybody who might not have it readily available. And those generally mean that we are encouraging participation for all, everybody to have a voice here, but we are not talking about direct business opportunities, financial opportunities, or anything direct business relationships there. And with that, I think we can dive into today's discussion.
Sorry, can I just preface something? We
Absolutely.
had talked about in the Cardea white paper wrapping up wrapping up the development roadmap, which was a little thin, and this was something that we wanted to run by Ken. Would it be useful to have that discussion after we have this discussion today? Because what
I think that order of
Is it
operations
active?
makes sense to me.
Good. Okay.
Yeah,
Good.
and I had chatted with Helen about, the sort of like communication about the new white paper release. I think we need to have a slightly more polished message on what we're working on. So
Agreed.
polishing that message would be helpful.
Yep.
Okay, so we'll just earmark the last, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes for that discussion, or sooner if we get through the conversation. Does anybody want to say hello or introduce themselves? Most of us are returners.
Hi, this is Manju Devraj. Yeah, good evening.
Hello.
Hello, hi.
Good evening. Where in the world are you calling in from?
I'm calling from right now from India, Bangalore.
Excellent. Welcome.
Thank
We're
you.
happy to have you.
Yeah.
And
Thank
what
you very much.
where are you from? What kind of organization?
I am from the cybersecurity background. So I do cybersecurity consulting. I'm a director for a company called Secure Logic. I work as a
Excellent.
director. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we're very happy to have you here.
Yeah, we do. Our partners work on blockchain, decentralized solutions, digital IDs and stuff. So that brings me here. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Alrighty. So diving into today's discussion, I did throw up a couple of slides just to kind of facilitate the conversation. So we have something to look at as we go through this. They're not pretty, so don't judge my slide creation skills here. And let me just put them, I'm going to leave them in edit mode so that we can maybe beef them up as we go. So we have been talking about kind of pivoting our discussion to, rather than clinical based credentials, to an identity credential that supports the healthcare space. This solves a bunch of problems that are recurring themes in the healthcare space around duplicate identities, sharing of sometimes identities and other challenges. And so I wanted to lay out a little bit for this discussion. And I did just have a conversation with a colleague who works at a federally qualified health center in the US to talk about sort of whether this was an appealing solution to them and what are the concerns that they have, so that we can brainstorm how we would address those concerns so that this could be really viable on the ground in the healthcare community. So before we get into that, I just wanted to talk about a couple of the ecosystems that I think are on the table for an identity solution to help manage. And they obviously come with various pros and cons, but just to give a little bit of context, right? There's a single provider who potentially has multiple locations. Even a single location would be potentially viable for this. but especially those that have multiple locations, which means potentially different staff, different, registrars, different doctors, but all part of the same single organization network. They usually use a single EMR, but not always. So for example, the federally qualified health center I was talking to earlier, they have something like 13 locations. Most of those locations are primary care, doing like regular general medicine. And then they have one hub location, which is where all of their specialists are. So at a minimum, their provider community would be seeing 2 different locations in that network, their local primary care site, but then also if they're referred for specialty care, going to that hub location or their main office. So those 2 organizations don't necessarily know that that person's the same across, when they present for care. Another potential ecosystem is a larger, what's called an integrated delivery network. This is usually a big hospital system. I said that because they generally have hospitals, which include emergency departments and inpatient settings, but also typically they have a large outpatient network of offices and specialty doctors and things like that. So that's called an integrated delivery network, or an IDN for short. They generally have many is probably the better word, care locations and different types of care locations. They may be using a single EMR, but more likely than not, they may also have multiple EMRs depending on how they have grown. Sometimes there's acquisitions and they're not so quick to bring everybody onto one system. So that's a variable there. There are also, and maybe small network is the wrong term here, but there's sort of a more closely knit network. This, for example, could be an IPA of sorts. That can be defined in multiple ways. An IPA is a sort of a provider network that has grouped together for a common goal. Those goals are often tied to financial reimbursements and negotiating powers, but that's not always the case. Sometimes they are banding together to tackle a specific healthcare problem. So very popular right now, at least in the US, are what are called behavioral health IPAs. And so that's networks of behavioral health providers who are tackling challenges with the unhoused, with otherwise sort of unstable patient populations who are not good candidates for physical health. They need sort of supportive services. And so that includes multiple different organizations who have come together. They would have multiple locations and different EMRs. They're not necessarily all treating the same population. They don't know all of the same patients, but they have some overlap in their goals and potentially in their patient population. And then there's larger networks. I don't think this is necessarily our starting point, but just to add to the growing network here is, for example, a health plan. A health plan might cover, 1 million or more lives, as they're called in the healthcare health plan space. They're called lives or members. Those members are not tied to a specific network of clinical providers, right? You can go in network or out of network. Either way you go for care, you give them your insurance ID, at least in the US, and then you're going to have to pay your copay and all of that jazz. But in some of those plans, you can go anywhere you want. And so it's not necessarily a defined physical network, but it is a defined population of patients. Any questions, comments, clarifications on those kind of ecosystems I've laid out?
So an undefined network is rather ambiguous.
Yes, exactly.
Might be multiple networks. Is that the case? Or I think a little clarity around that term would help us. We could, if somebody
Around this here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to communicate is that it's they're not limited, right? They can potentially go anywhere. So when we're talking about sort of where do we want to fit and explore further for Cardea, to be implemented. My vote is that we start here, right? Because we've removed and simplified who needs to be involved to verify and prove that that identity solution adds value.
Okay, so the main point of undefined network is that it's very loosely.
Sure.
Undefined is fine. I think I'm just trying to get at what you were trying to communicate, and it's so it has a combination of in network and out of network, or it transcends networks. Is that's kind of
Yes. Yes, exactly.
So it's a freaking mess, is what you're saying.
Yes, there are sort of no boundaries potentially. It depends a little bit on that
Is that
the
a
health
flat
plan.
network? Are you trying to say it's a flat network without hierarchy or probably proper design?
Yes. So and specifically in the US, right? If you're on vacation, you can still go to a health anywhere, right? Let's say I'm on vacation in California, I can go to a California doctor if I have strep throat and they'll treat me. And that's a much wider who would have known that I would go to a doctor in California. And so the opportunity for interaction is not limited to a specifically defined population of, in this case, care locations.
Is that not the case with the current scenario wherein there is no perimeter, there is no boundaries, it's zero trust, and anybody can connect to a network, but we validate the trust of the identity or the device. Yeah.
It would be applicable, but I think Keela's point is that that's the most complex scenario. If we can pick a simpler one to start with, we might be able to bootstrap an organization into using it. If you have to get everybody in a loosely defined network, or where there's people in the network, out of the network, and everywhere, it will be a more difficult process to get anyone onboarded, or to get enough critical mass to make it interesting.
Agreed. Agreed. And I think the other one that's worth maybe adding based on my conversation here, just for to be comprehensive, and maybe this becomes a kind of under this small network, is a separate implementation, which is vendor-based. And this is becoming more popular. So everybody who uses a single technical vendor has like an additional connection with each other, even though they may be unrelated to each other. They are all connected. So for example, Epic, as one of the main players in the large EMR space, they have something called Epic Everywhere, where if anybody on Epic can sort of, as long as it's enabled and you've gotten the right workflows involved, you can see other Epic data for the same person in what are otherwise unconnected relationships, right? Hospital A and Hospital B have nothing to do with each other, but they're both on the same EMR. Similarly, there are other EMRs that have those kinds of capabilities. And so you could start to see that becomes like a network within a mini network within the larger ecosystem of the healthcare space. So yes, the purpose of me going through this was sort of to lay out different different layers of this community, so that we can dig into knowing that this is sort of the evolution of growth in the different spaces here. Where do we start? And this one sounds really nice to me because it's simplified. And so I want to talk through a little bit about what that looks like, right? And what is it that we're suggesting the solution might be, and how does that help them? And what are the challenges and we need to make sure we can address those. So what we had discussed as a solution here was an identity credential. that could be issued by this single healthcare facility. So for example, their primary care provider site, and my example where there's, maybe 10 primary care sites and one hub, their primary care site, who knows them well, could issue them a credential when they see them, verifying that they've got everything right, they've got the right person, they do the homework to make sure, like, yes, I'm correct. I've done my due diligence here. They could then issue that credential. That credential could then go with the patient when they go to their specialist at the hub office, so that the hub office could scan their identity credential and it would pull up their chart without them having to type the person's name, guess which Keela Shatskin is the right Keela Shatskin presenting in front of them, and bypass a lot of those pain points that healthcare registration desks experience. That's sort of the goal, the proposition that we've made, right? That has value. And so if we look through that, I want to delve through the benefits to that scenario and then the challenges so that we can tackle them together. So, and I think these benefits are, I have single provider, but really they're for all of those ecosystems. I think some of these benefits are the same. They are repeated for regardless of the ecosystem that we're talking about. But delving into them, the first is reducing registration staff / human error. And right, so that's if I typed Keela wrong, maybe I found a totally different record. I thought it was the right record. Maybe there's a Keely Shatskin out there and they picked that one and they said, cool, you're checked in, go see the doctor, and it's on the wrong chart. So that's in selecting the patient and the patient selection. It's also potentially helpful for avoiding creation of a duplicate chart. So they looked for me and they couldn't find me. So they make a new chart for me. Unbeknownst to them, they just spelled my name incorrectly. They didn't pull up the right thing. They didn't acknowledge that I already had a record. And now they've created split medical records in their local system for me. So when I go to see that doctor, it's like I have no patient history at all. I have no medical history available to them because I'm on a brand new chart. And that creates a lot of medical healthcare space waste because they have to rerun tests. They now have to have staff that remediate those split records on their side. That can take hours and lots of staff time depending on the complexity of the case. We also, and this is an interesting point because this is both to me a pro and a con that we need to talk through, is potentially reducing the intake procedure and time needed to do that intake. So for example, when you present at a healthcare facility, they'll hand you the clipboard or the proverbial clipboard. It might be electronic these days in some offices. And you're having to say, here's my name, this is my gender, this is my my gender identity, this is my race and ethnicity, and you're going through a series of questions that you might be asked every single time you present. And so handing the clipboard and doing that every time results in process effort, right? You have to then input that data every time. Maybe you're scanning the paperwork if you're still on paper, or you're verifying the data points. But if you were here last week, like, did you really need to do that again?
So there's different types of data that are sometimes collected during registration. There's demographic data, right, that talks about who the person is. And then there's sometimes medical, either your current medical situation or symptoms, things like that are collected, correct?
That is correct.
So probably what we're focusing on here is on the demographic data so that they can focus. So they may still want to recollect current medical or historical facts about your care or treatment, but or verify that data more particularly. But if we can get them to stop fiddling with who is the right patient so they pull up the right chart, that can give them a better basis or spend more time on the medical side and less time on the identification side.
Yes, agreed. And there is an interesting problem statement that I've seen in data, which is you may have the answer. So race and ethnicity, for example, have gained a lot of attention through the pandemic because of some of the inequities that were seen through varieties of layers of handling the pandemic. And having the data is important to be able to measure the health equity or inequity of how things are being done. So race and ethnicity are super valuable to that. They're part of our social construct for how we group populations to evaluate health equity. And that data has now been mandated in a lot of scenarios for capture. However, what happens sometimes is if you're really sick today and you don't feel like filling out this paperwork, you might say, I don't want to answer this question. And there's an option, right? I choose not to disclose my race or ethnicity or sexual orientation or whatever. There's like opting out values that are valid. So if I'm not feeling well today and you've handed me this paper, which I filled out before, you have a race and ethnicity on file for me. But today I say I'm choosing not to disclose. What ends up happening is that system updates your value from whatever you had on file that was actually valuable and meaningful data, like Asian Pacific Islander, to you choose not to disclose, which puts you in a bucket that takes you out of the analytics and the ability to measure you for health equity and potentially health disparities. So sometimes there's an issue where it's overwriting valid, helpful values with not valid and not helpful values just because you've asked them again and they're not feeling like answering today. And so repeating these questions has some negative consequence there that gets remediated if we don't ask them every single time. If you're able to say, is this still correct? Is this still how you identify? And if the answer is yes, then you can just input the same answer again. Any other comments on sort of the benefit of being able to bring your sort of identity with you? Some of the cases that I was talking about with my FQHC counterpart, and I know not everybody has had these experiences, is that there are patients, sometimes they're twins and sometimes they are unrelated, who have the same first name and last name and date of birth. So having a credential would help mitigate that because, of course, that credential would be different and would pull up the correct record even when they're demographically look the same or similar. And she was telling me about a case where she had 6 kids from a family she was treating, and they all had the same first name. Six kids with the same first name. And that creates challenges in making sure you're pulling up the right kids chart when you're delivering care to them. And you want to make sure that those charts do not commingle patient data. You would basically be contaminating the patient chart with somebody else's health information. And so a credential could help mitigate that by ensuring that this is the correct person who has the same name as somebody else that they know. Okay, any comments? Otherwise, we can talk about some of the challenges. Okay. So I think for me, some of the challenges are, do they acknowledge that they have a problem? I think certain organizations are more willing to admit that their data quality has issues, and so their patient identity, which is the core of that data quality, is where they need to spend their time and energy. Fortunately, a lot of organizations do acknowledge this as an ongoing challenge. They just don't know how to solve for it. And so that problem could be that they have those disparate identities, and identity issues can be in one of two directions. They can be that you have two people sharing a chart. That's the most egregious of the identity issues in my personal experience, because you often don't know until you like read the chart that you've got two people commingled. The alternative disparity is that you create a second chart. And so you are when you're treating the patient that you're seeing today, you're treating them without the information about their historical medical care. And so you're not able to fully treat them. And that becomes problematic as well for other reasons. Similarly, those intake procedures and those identity verification procedures can also have problems. As we mentioned, the issue where the race value might get overwritten with a less valuable answer. That problem statement is not discussed frequently as an example. Similarly, right, if you have a patient who maybe is transgender or has other sensitive demographic data, they may not be comfortable disclosing that over and over again. And so it took a while to get the answer, and now maybe you're going to overwrite it with a less valid answer because they weren't comfortable for the 700th time filling out that paper. So those are all examples there. I think the other challenge that I wanted to lay out, and then we'll talk about some specifics that I discussed with this particular site, are resourcing. So if we're talking about implementing verifiable credentials in a healthcare facility, there are several challenges to getting that off the ground. The first is all healthcare facilities are heavily integrated, for the most part, with an EMR or an electronic medical record. That system would need to be involved in this solution to connect with a verifiable credential, to build the APIs or other technology to pull the data out of the credential and into the EMR chart to verify and connect it with those charts, but also to issue a identity credential once the person has been fully vetted. So that's a lot of integration. Those EMRs are not the fastest in developing new projects and sort of cutting edge things, although if it's repeatable to them, that they might be interested. The other is that there are staffing needs, right? We would need that healthcare facility to be involved so we can understand their workflows and how things are being implemented today, where their pain points are, so that we're actually addressing and solving a direct problem for them. And potentially the most costly are the changes that would be needed in their workflow, right? So rather than handing them a clipboard, we now have a procedure where you're going to scan a QR code. Well, do you have the tools at that front desk to scan a barcode? And then assuming we've gotten past that workflow review and implementation, it's the training of the staff so that they know how to implement this new procedure, right? And because we're talking about this, it has to be in the network to get the benefit. We're talking about, 10 to 15 sites that all have to be trained. You'd want everybody online so that you can start to reap the benefit of that patient presenting with their identity credential at any of the locations. One location isn't going to quite solve the problem. So unpacking this a little bit, we're talking about a hardware issue, right? Do you have cameras, for example, that can scan a QR code at those front desks? And so many sites have started to add webcams so that they can actually take a picture of the patient that's presenting, so that they can have that as a sort of biometric verification. So they're not just going on name. That helps combat the problem of those patients who have exactly the same name and date of birth. What does their face look like can get you a little bit further to getting the right patient. There are also some challenges around people's devices changing. So just especially depending on what environment you're in, people might use, prepaid phones. that have a certain number of minutes, and once those run out, they're getting a new phone. So their devices are turning over quite frequently. And that can cause problems if we're depending on them to have their credential. So making sure we have a good mechanism for them to restore their credential the next time they get a phone would be really valuable. We've talked through that problem statement before. And then the other really important point that she made in our conversation is, of course, the challenge around kids and how would the identity credentials work for kids, specifically also around the biometric binding or the identity binding of that credential to the kid. So for example, she was giving me a case where she is treating twins, so they have the same date of birth, and their first and middle names are the same but reversed. So for example, it was Mary Jane and Jane Mary are their first and middle names, and they're twins, so they usually get seen on the same day. And so making sure that they pull up the correct chart and they pull up the correct identity credential when they do that and verify I'm scanning the right identity credential for the right kid was very, very important to her. And so I think we would have to talk about how we do that identity binding in a way that the delegated credentials would also be very clearly able to be distinguished for each of those identities. So I've been doing a lot of talking. Let's see if anybody else has any commentary on that. Okay.
Good presentation so far. Very interesting.
Excellent. Thanks, Steve. The other problem statement that she stated to me was not so much at least in the US system, there is quite a bit of fraud that happens where people sort of borrow somebody else's insurance because maybe they don't have insurance. And her reaction to that was that's not her concern. Her concern is making sure that she has one chart per person and that it's not going to get contaminated. And I think I've mentioned before, especially for their practice, they were having an issue with sort of a bait and switch problem. So they'd come together, the person who owned the record would check in, and then a different person would walk in the back to see the doctor. And so having some workflow for that, maybe it's that they check the credential again when they call the person into the back office. Similarly, if you call to the waiting room, okay, I'm ready to see Carmen Rivera, and Carmen Rivera stands up and comes to the back. Well, there might have been more than one Carmen Rivera in that waiting room, and they call the wrong one comes back. And she mentioned some stories about that where, there's two Carmen Riveras sitting in the waiting room, one's for podiatry and one's for gastroenterology, and they like go to the wrong appointment because there was no additional verification that they've got the correct Carmen Rivera, even just from the waiting room. And so that was another point. And I think being able to do sort of a secondary verification on bringing them back for care would also be something that's important. And I think that would be easily achievable with the verifiable credential, right? Because you could link the credential to the appointment and say, wait a minute, this isn't the right credential for this appointment. It's a different Carmen Rivera. So I think there would be ways to combat that. But those were additional problem statements that she was expressing. And interestingly, this particular practice, which is why I spoke to them, had implemented a biometric pilot. So they had implemented cameras for irises, primarily because it's no touch. It doesn't get affected by the temperature, which vein recognition can. And so they had been piloting a whole patient identity verification implementation with iris biometrics, which is still very interesting in my opinion. However, they did not continue that. And so I think they are an interesting candidate to try a different approach, like a verifiable credential, where you do all the work up front and then it's like an easy check-in, an easier check-in process. So from my perspective, I think as we evaluate this, the main issues that I heard from her are the biometric binding that has to happen with the credential, whether that's through a picture or something else, and being able to manage the credentials for your family members and ensure that you're picking the right ones. And updating the data behind those credentials, having a mechanism to say, you know, here's a newer picture. I want to update my, you know, I look different. Maybe you've lost a lot of weight or whatever. That would be important to make sure that stuff stays current. So we would have to address that from the credential perspective. And maybe that's with the site getting to reissue the credential ever so often so that it's current. So that's what I have brainstormed so far. And I think the next step is to walk us through sort of how we would go about exploring an implementation of Cardea at an organization like an FQHC or some other single provider but multiple location site.
It seems as if this is the white paper challenge, the real white paper challenge.
It is. Yes.
So yeah, I mean, I do see a point. In what sense is a likely titivated Cardea white paper relevant to the market that we want to develop, whereas something that figured this out might be a much more powerful way of engaging people than simply data, a kind of broad data sharing. Here's how we specifically take on these problems.
Yes. Yes. And then maybe going out and actually implementing it in this scenario, which
exactly.
she seemed, to be interested in, at least in preliminary conversation. So it's sort of like, yeah, let's talk about this problem statement. Let's tackle those issues that she's worried about. And we're still talking about probably 80% solved, because you have patients who don't have a phone. They're not going to be able to manage a digital credential, let alone, keeping on top of their healthcare. But I think when you solve for the 80%, then you can spend your human capital and human energy on that 20% that are really much more problematic.
Yeah. Well, I think also guardianship has to be resolved in the technology. That's still an issue.
Yes.
I think white papers on this and consent would be really powerful. The consent one doesn't have to be super long.
Agreed. And maybe what it is, Trevor, how do you feel about this? Maybe it's like a one-pager on top of the white pager, the white page. That was just was very key.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. I mean, so it's like, here's a use case.
Yeah. I mean, it's also relevant to this, I think, this group, this audience. So it's a pity we lost Ken, but yeah, I think we probably need to sketch out an architectural solution for this. That's the next step, and then it's bang out a white paper.
Agreed. And I think we could get through the technical, with some assumptions. I think we could outline what the technical implementation would look like for this scenario. And sort of where are the points? Like, we know there'd have to be an API, right, between the EMR and the issuing of the credential, and then of course reading the credential back into the EMR, right? That's sort of a two-way API there. and outlining that identity binding / verification step. So what is the prompt to the person who's saying, yes, this is right. We've got the right person. It's not somebody holding their phone. And I think sort of walking through those steps where we could tackle the most concerning points that were raised, at least by this FQHC, I think we would get pretty far down that implementation pipeline, even without participation from any, EMRs or facilities directly. So I guess the question then would be, how do we should dive into what that looks like. To me, it's probably we need the diagram of that like workflow.
Yeah, yes.
Patient, it's sort of the patient experience. And then we need to tackle these issues. Trevor, anything else that you think we need to get solved for that sort of addendum to the larger white paper?
No, not off the top of my head, no.
Okay. So I agree, we probably want Ken to dive into some of this with us.
Yeah, and probably Sam Curran as well.
Agreed. Yeah, I think in this case, we've talked about identity binding so much, but we haven't really nailed it.
Yeah.
That would have to be solved. Were you going to say something else?
No.
Okay.
Well, yes, I was. I'm not, I mean, given with Thanksgiving being upon us, I'm not sure how much progress we're going to make before then, but I think this is the absolute direction we should be going in and what we should be focusing all our energy on. That's my view. I'm can't speak for Ken, obviously.
I agree. Yeah, it does seem like a really strong direction to go. I agree.
Yeah, great work, Keela.
Did what I could. I do have a couple of other irons in the fire on this topic, but in terms of ready for today's discussion, this was sort of the one that was furthest along. So there are some, and we've mentioned this before, there are some dedicated organizations or companies that are dedicated to patient identity, like that is their job, and they're like a third party you would bring in. And I think they could also play a role in an identity credential issuance, and sort of holding the primary identity credential. So that's another avenue that we'll continue to explore. It aligns with this issue and problem statement that we've just walked through. And certainly those kinds of facilities that we've laid out in terms of the ecosystems who may or may not already engage with those third-party solutions could leverage that. I think the point is, rather than having human or algorithmic solutions to say, is this or is this not the same person? A definitive match, which by using a credential would really help alleviate that problem. You're not constantly saying, is this name, date of birth, gender, address, phone, do they all match? You know, if somebody misspells, or specifically for Hispanic names that have multiple parts, where sometimes they use like the first last name, sometimes they use the second last name, sometimes they use both. Those kinds of issues are circumvented through this solution because you don't have to answer. You just say, here's my credential. So you, if as long as you did it really well the first time for that issuance, and then have a procedure where you would ask if they want to change anything and potentially reissue that credential so that there's an opportunity for updates.
And I'm sure something could be engineered over DIDCOM, which would be, sort of update credential. And then that would initiate a revocation process and a reissuance process.
Yes. Just like that. Okay. Okay. Any other thoughts that we should make sure we add to this? And then I think it sounds like we have some homework to do offline. Happy to have additional engagement at this group for that, or we can do some work and bring the next round of updates to this committee. Trevor, it sounds like you think maybe we sit on our edits a little longer, get something together so that we can issue them at the same time.
You mean with the current white paper
Yes.
revision? Honestly, I think we should replace the first. I mean, it's given the work done, we should replace as quickly as possible the old white paper with a new white paper with the new, just as an update, but not really pour anything more into it. I do think we need to starting over with this, like completely new, fresh page.
Okay.
None of the very quick summary of what verifiable credentials are and the technology, and very quickly go into the use case.
Okay, that sounds good. So you think we should, and maybe you and Helen, I'm not sure exactly what needs to happen to get that white paper updated, if it's just getting it updated on our thing and saying, hey, we updated it.
It's super simple. We just need that one page proofed, the development roadmap page.
Okay.
Because it's a bit thin. And it
So
might be worth if you could maybe summarize what you've done here in a paragraph, maybe set out our next focus is going to be on all of this stuff. That, rewriting the development page in light of this, the development roadmap in light of this paper. I think that's the final step. Okay.
And then we'll reissue it sort of without as much fanfare as we were suggesting.
I think, and the reissuance will emphasize the new roadmap, the new development roadmap.
Okay. Okay, that sounds good. I can work on that. I do want to call out that our next meeting, I haven't done a great job, and
is on Thanksgiving.
Is Thanksgiving, yeah. Or is it here? So our next meeting is Thanksgiving for the US. And so therefore we will not be hosting a meeting. So that means that our next meeting, just to talk calendars, will be the second Tuesday of December, which is the 14th of December. So I think that gives us plenty of... Sorry?
It's Thursday. It's second and fourth Thursdays, right?
I'm sorry. Did I say Tuesday? I meant Thursday.
Yeah. Okay.
The 14th is in fact a Thursday. So I said the wrong day of the week, but I said the right date. Thanks, Steve. Yes. So December 14th. So I think what we can commit to is getting that white paper wrapped up offline, Trevor, so that we can get it out maybe even before Thanksgiving. Yeah. And then try to get something drafted so that we can start to react to it and beef it up, and maybe try to get Sam to attend for the 14th to kind of expand and elaborate on this scenario. And I think once we've gotten something to react to, we can potentially invite some of those kinds of healthcare facilities to listen to what we're thinking and get their feedback to make sure we've really addressed their primary concerns.
Yep.
I think that would be really valuable before we actually take this to go try to implement somewhere.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so we've got a plan. Anything else that we should be having on our agenda roadmap here? get this updated. Sorry, I was worrying about my deck and not updating our notes. So I will update these. And you guys can let us know. And did I, Manju, is that the right split for your name, or is it all one? Is that your first name?
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. That's right. You're right. Absolutely.
Okay.
You got it right.
Excellent.
Just a note regarding the credentials you just put up, right? Do you need to validate the credentials before you update?
You mean
Updates to
before you
credentials.
reissue them?
Yeah, because there are cases wherein somebody met with an accident. They don't have the identity. Like if they use facial, the facial doesn't work anymore because maybe there is or they lost weight, as you said.
Yep.
So how do you validate? Means you need to validate, right? Validate the credentials because before you update it. But you might use a traditional method, or you might use how do you validate that?
Yeah, exactly. So I think at that point, you would defer back to, so you'd have their credential and you'd say, this
Yeah, okay.
doesn't look right. Let's verify that you are. Maybe let me see your other ID so that you could make sure you've really got the right person. And then instead of just allowing that to continue to persist, you could say, okay, let's do a new picture to tie to your credential. Or
Yep.
you got married, let's update your last name. Or you are now identifying as a different gender. Let's get that updated. I think that you would have to defer back to sort of those, there's still a person.
Yeah, defer back. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
But then reissuing it so that the stale data doesn't continue to persist, that they're operating on the latest and best credential possible.
Yeah, just get the stale out, yeah, and just keep it updated. Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Because I think unlike some other credentials where potentially that data does not really change, like, through COVID, we were talking about vaccination credentials. It was very unlikely that you got the vaccine, you got it on the date you got it. It's not going to change. In the identity space, your identity does change. Maybe your perception of your race and ethnicity changes because those aren't measurable values. They're, somebody's identity perception.
Yeah. True.
So it is a little bit different from that standpoint.
Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Well, I think we've got some marching orders and some work to do offline. So we'll see what we can move along between now and our next meeting, which again is that second Thursday of December. And I think with that, we can give everybody 2 minutes back. And I hope everybody, if you celebrate Thanksgiving, I hope you have a wonderful holiday.
Take care.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Bye.
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 Bye. Bye.